Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ramses from REGIO, and I want to invite you to join me from Interreg Central Europe, now over to Interreg Northwest Europe, where we will hear from our next and last speaker, Ghyoot. And I say last but not least, because Michael, working with Rotor, has been one of the pioneers in Europe in not only dreaming, but also transforming our construction industry away from a linear industry where buildings are built, used, and discarded as waste, and to transform it into a circular built environment where we can design buildings for disassembly, repurpose buildings during their lifetime, and afterwards deconstruct them and use the building materials to build new buildings. So part of this has been done in context of the Interreg Northwest Europe project. And I think if he's here already, I pass the floor to him. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, excellent. I see that the screen is already sharing. Thanks, Ramses, for the introduction, and hello to everybody. So, as Ramses explained, I work at Rotor. Maybe we can switch to the next slide to present briefly who Rotor is. In fact, it started as a non-profit organization. It still is. We started in 2005, mostly active in analyzing material flows in the construction economy with the view of reusing and promoting the reuse of building materials. And then a bit later on in 2016, we launched another initiative which is organized as a cooperative company called Rotor Deconstruction, or Rotor DC, which is active in salvaging and selling reusable building materials. So next slide presents the first encountering between Rotor and this topic of reusing building materials. It was in 2008 as part of a pre-study we conducted on the behalf of the Brussels public authorities, who at that time wanted to promote the development of a market for second-hand building materials. And so we investigated different opportunities to do so, mostly by visiting similar initiatives all around Brussels and in other countries as well. They intended to do that in the context of the social economy. Next slide, please. There you see one of the appendix of this pre-study, which was the very first listing of reclamation and salvage dealers around Brussels. And we used this listing for a few years. Anytime people contacted us with the purpose of finding a materials that could be reused, or finding a way to reuse materials that they had dismantled on their construction sites. And so next slide, we brought this project a bit further in 2011, and it's a project that is still going on. It's called the Opalis project. Basically, it consists of documenting active salvage and reclamation companies. We started around Brussels, and then we enlarged the scope to Belgium and then to Northwest Europe as a whole. That was thanks to the FCRBE project, about which I will speak in a while. So we see on the next slide that basically Opalis is based on a lot of field work. That's our methodology. We visit most of the companies that we document online. Opalis is a web directory presenting those different dealers and the type of materials that they trade and the type of services they provide. By doing so, we also try to discuss with them the challenges and the barriers that they meet in their practices. And all of that is documented on opalis.eu, which is a freely accessible website. Next slide, please. And the project Opalis was a very important milestone, I would say, in our development, because it demonstrated to us that although some materials were relatively constantly or well taken in charge by existing companies, there were a lot of other materials that were not, that were simply discarded off as waste during demolition works. And we saw that mostly in Brussels, which is a a city in which we have a lot of offices building, as you probably know, producing a very specific type of demolition waste, mostly all the interior fittings and yeah, interior spaces that are quite regularly renovated. And so we thought, okay, some dots need a connection, and that's why we launched in 2016 Rotor DC as an autonomous project active in salvaging and selling those materials. You see there the aerial view of our facilities. It's a former chocolate factory in the city center of Brussels. You see it's a relatively big space with outdoor storage spaces, but also an inside showroom and warehouses. That's really the key in this business. You need a bit of place because most of the time you will need to store the materials between the moment they are dismantled and the moment they are needed on a new development. Next, please. So basically for Rotor DC, the source of materials can be very different. Sometimes it's Rotor DC teams that are operating the dismantling of the materials. Sometimes the materials are traded from other contractors or other reclamation dealers. Sometimes it's also private clients or small contractors who bring the materials, the dismantled materials, to our places, and then we take care of the sale, and we split the profit of the sales in this case. Next slide. Yeah, this slide shows that most of the work, really the core business of Rotor DC is about lengthening the life cycle of the building components, and that entails a lot of manual labor, which is embedded in these reusable materials through cleaning, cutting to dimensions, packaging, documenting also takes a lot of work. But it's a very good example of what a circular economy can be, an economy in which we lengthen the life cycle of goods through very low impacting operations and a good potential to relocate job creations and labor anchored in a at a regional level. So next slide. Yes, this is the one about the Interreg NWE project. In fact, through Opalis, through Rotor DC, and through many other projects, we saw that there were still a lot of systemic barriers hindering the practice of reusing building materials, especially in the context of the professional and the formal construction industry. And so that's why we tried to foster a collective effort with partners with whom we already worked on a local level, but also partners from other regions, from France and from the UK. And we applied to the Interreg NWE program to be able to carry out this sort of a more systemic efforts to promote reuse. Next slide. This is a short overview of the main project outputs so far. So on the first line, you see quite a lot of documentation being developed to address different issues related to reuse. This documentation mostly targets building developers, designers, architects, but also contractors, and help them to really implement reuse in their practices. We also developed a truly reclaimed label attesting the genuinely reclaimed origin of those second-hand materials. And then we tested all these new methods through 36 pilot operations. Next slide, please. Yeah, another part of the project, as I said, was about documenting and shedding light on the salvage industry, the reuse sector, mostly through these two online directories, Opalis and SalvoWeb. But we also took the opportunity of those visits to conduct a statistical survey of the trade. We estimate in this study that there are about 1,700 companies active in the reclamation of building materials in Northwest Europe, with the particularity that 99% of them are either small or micro, and that maybe explain why they are not so well structured. There is no federation, there is no representative body for them, so that they are slightly overlooked. and maybe not considered as much as they could, given the type of services and the type of activity they provide. Interestingly, the ratio of the amount of full-time equivalents in this sector is quite high compared to the amount of materials. So it tends to show that this type of activity really has a huge potential for job creation while preserving materials and enabling their future reuse. Next slide, please. Yes, this is an illustration of the different sorts of guidelines and handbook we produced during the first phase of the FCRBE project. Next slide. This is a very popular deliverable of the project. It's a collection of 36 material sheets documenting in great details all the characteristics of commonly reclaimed and reusable materials, at least the characteristics that are known, but also identifying the characteristics which require further investigation if the materials are to be effectively reused. Next slide. Please, next slide. Yes, these are the pilot operations. As I said, we assisted building owners and design teams in integrating either reclamation or reuse operations as part of ongoing construction projects. And the goal there was mainly to test the newly developed methods in real life conditions, I would say, but also, of course, to introduce a certain amount of stakeholders from the construction industry to adopt reuse practices. And then we also wanted, that was one of the project indicator, it was reusing or reclaiming 36 tons of materials. And normally we know, thanks to those operations, we probably outreached this goal because some of them were quite ambitious in the end. Maybe the next slide. And yeah, this is a final slide presenting all the other efforts that we conducted as part of this FCRBE project to really communicate and disseminate the messages about reusing building materials through a mobile exhibition, which is still touring and available for exhibitions if needed. We also addressed the question of public policies through a roadmap, which explains a series of measures that can be taken by public authorities at different levels to encourage reuse in their territory. There was a lot of documentation being developed to address the most frequently asked question about reusing building materials. And then, of course, a lot of dissemination events through workshops, seminars, webinars, big presentation days, that sort of formats, which really helped to reach a lot of target groups, and that was, of course, an important part of the project. So this, in a nutshell, was the FCRBE project and where it started from. So I hope it contributed to the discussions of today.
Thank you so much, Michael. Indeed, thank you. Just thank you for this fantastic example and for showing us also the cooperation dimension and how it really contributes to create this circular economy, not only in Belgium, but sometimes across borders, across nations in Northwest Europe.